Single biggest challenge for you right now with Human Rights Watch for the next 5 years?
Well, the thing I'm very worried about is this rise of autocratic populists who are challenging the very idea of democracy. And Trump epitomizes this, but there are mini Trumps around the world, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Putin in Russia, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil. And what they all have in common is they gain power by demonizing some unpopular minority. So it's an anti-rights agenda that they pursue. And then once in power, they all do the same thing. They all try to attack the checks and balances on their power. So the journalists, the activists, the judges, anybody that can constrain them, they want to try to undermine. And they use the language, the rhetoric of saying we're looking out for the people. We're protecting the people from these immigrants. We're protecting the people from these Muslims. There's always somebody. We're protecting the people from these gays. The reality is they're protecting themselves. And they're using this unpopular minority to build an electoral majority, but then they're looking out for themselves, not for the people. And we need to demonstrate that and build up a much more vigorous defense of democracy, because despite all of its imperfections, it still is the best way of having an accountable government, a government that serves the needs of the people rather than its own needs.
Will China ever be a democracy?
I mean, you can never say never. We've got a long ways to go. I mean, at this point, I'd be happy to have a country that is back where it was 5 years ago, where there was an emerging civil society, there was the beginning of the rule of law, there was the beginning of independent journalism. All of that's been snuffed out. 5 years ago, we didn't have 1 million Uyghurs in prison. So, before we start going to this kind of pie in the sky stuff, I'd like to have this dictatorship behave more responsibly.
Right. What about Russia?
Russia is also in trouble. I mean, Putin, looks good compared to Yeltsin, his predecessor, who, was a disaster, drunken disaster, total economic collapse. But, again, the country is just stagnating economically. Is living on its oil revenue, but hasn't built up a diversified economy at all. And so Putin also is, using populist techniques to appeal to the kind of more conservative countryside. But he's lost the big cities. If you look what happened recently in Moscow, there was a city council election. The opposition put forward a bunch of candidates. Putin had them all disqualified. So there were big demonstrations, but then the opposition got smart and they said, well, okay, our candidates aren't running, but we're going to vote for whoever is not your candidate. And they orchestrated victories for all these just non-Putinites, and they weren't great people necessarily, but the whole point was that they were not the people who were going to support Putin. And so, you see in the big cities of Russia, as you see in the big cities of Turkey or Hungary or Poland, I mean, in many of these places where you have rising autocrats, is that they actually have lost the cities. And they're appealing to this more conservative bastion in the hinterland. But that's not a long-term strategy. And so they're all backpedaling, they're all on the defensive, and they're all resorting to increasing repression to try to maintain some grasp on power.
Yeah, and repression and also, I don't know if you call it terrorism, but like Putin goes out and stirs things up, assassinations in countries. And like you said, what's happening in Syria, they're very good at punching above their weight by frightening other countries, probably with their old mechanisms of, FSA and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these military adventures in eastern Ukraine and in Syria are partly designed to whip up nationalism at home, but those have run their course. And in fact, at this point, people are saying, well, so why exactly are we in eastern Ukraine when Europe is imposing these sanctions as a result and the Russian economy is completely stagnating? It's hard to defend.
Yeah, but also we see assassinations in this country, assassinations in Bulgaria, blatant things used to project power. And it's amazing how a few people doing that can give Putin the edges he needs internally and externally.
Well, no, and Putin, the FSB, his intelligence service has been willing to assassinate.
Yeah.
Even in Europe, that happened obviously in Britain, it's happened in Berlin.
Yeah.
And the person who's doing this just recently, it happened in France just a week ago, is Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the president of Chechnya, the Russian Republic, a very close ally of Putin, but who's been the most ruthless by far, and who's gone after critics of his rule wherever they are in Europe. And I think the European protests have been too weak, often mute. So there is a need to stand up and to say, this is really a step too far.
Yeah, it's it's hard to believe when I read some of this stuff that that's actually happening. You know, these guys are traveling through these stations in London and killing people and using these, rubbing these, Vaseline-like substances, and
Nerve
people
agents.
are touching nerve agents. I mean,
yeah.
it's just, it kind of pains me that that's happening in 2020. That's still going on.
It's remarkable. And
Unlike Ai Weiwei, are you optimistic in the future? 100 years from now, Kenneth, do you think that we will be living in a place where human rights are generally respected, or do you think this will always be a battle?
I think it's always a battle. I am optimistic. I mean, first of all, I think we've seen enormous positive changes. If you kind of look back 20, 30 years, there's been huge transformations in the world. Eastern Europe used to be Soviet dictatorships. Now they're mostly democracies. Latin America was a bunch of military dictatorships. It's now mostly democracies. So you can look around the world. There's been vast improvement in many parts of the world. Then there are other places like the Middle East or Eastern Africa, which are very problematic still. So I think it's always a struggle. And the reason is that governments, by their nature, want to violate human rights, because governments by their nature want to stay in power, and human rights are inconvenient to that. They make it more difficult to stay in power. And so you're always going to need a human rights movement to fight back, to raise the cost of human rights abuse and to kind of affect that cost-benefit analysis that leads the government to go one way or the other in terms of respect for human rights. So that doesn't depress me. I think that's just reality. But I keep doing this because I see over and over how this kind of struggle makes a difference.
It's funny, I've got a guest on later today, Anthony Scaramucci, who spent 11 days in the White House, and he says the whole battle in Washington is to take what is a three-dimensional person and turn them into a two-dimensional meme and then assassinate the character and
just to cut out.
Rinse and repeat, And like you said, the governments use that to fight each other, and then human rights are the first thing to go. So I guess this will always be a battle of media, of power, of human rights.
Yeah, that's what it is. And we at Human Rights Watch, we're actually good at fighting back. We have a whole team of people stationed around the world who collect the firsthand evidence. So we get the truth. We can immediately see through the cover stories, and we're very good at getting that out. We have a typical day. We'll have 140 unique articles about our work around the world. Wow. We've got 11 million people following us on social media. We have an ability to project this, and governments hate that, but they're stuck with it.
Right.
And so, yes, we can fight back.